Once it became clear last summer that the Afghan government would fall, the highest priority became the quick and safe evacuation of Americans, eligible Afghans, and other allies. Then, once evacuated, they needed housing and services. That job fell to teams within the Defense and State Departments that included Hila Hanif. She's the director of the Defense Department's Afghanistan Strategy and Policy, and Holly Herrera. She's the chief of domestic resettlement at the State Department. Ladies, welcome to both of you. Hila, I want to start with you. You're supposed to do strategy and policy for Afghanistan. You're not supposed to evacuate thousands of people. What happened last summer and spring in your office?
So Mimi, thank you for having me. Last spring, actually starting from maybe February, March, at the beginning of the Biden administration, my office led for the Office of the Secretary of Defense, an extensive process by which we were helping develop positions for the Department of Defense for an interagency review on the administration's policy towards Afghanistan. As part of this lengthy process, we actually also, as the Department of Defense, do planning for a lot of different scenarios and what we call contingencies. And one of the scenarios that we had prepared for was if there's ever a time where the United States government will need to evacuate mainly U.S. citizens and also maybe citizens from other partner nations, how will we be able to execute that in conjunction with the Department of State and other colleagues? And later in the summer, when the situation in Afghanistan, specifically in Kabul, devolved, when it looked like the Afghan government may fall, we actually started to think about what would mean if we had to put some of those plans in motion. And so for many months, my office had worked with our colleagues at the White House, with our military colleagues, and then State Department and other colleagues to think through some of the logistics. And the logistics involve not only the logistics of securing an airport and physically evacuating people, but also the process by which you would, think through different immigration issues. How would you develop criteria on who gets evacuated, how they get evacuated, and then what happens when they leave when they leave Kabul and then have to go through transit points and onto the U.S. or other locations.
So, Hila, your team started to work around the clock. Work us through the process of evacuating an Afghan family.
Sure. Well, at the time, things were happening so fast in real time. There was a process by which we had worked for months with our State Department colleagues. First, how do you nominate different Afghans, specifically those that had worked to support U.S. forces throughout the 20 years that were in Afghanistan? And that process had been developed before, where we had to actually spend months ahead of time verifying their employment, verifying their credentials, verifying that they actually had some sort of security check in advance, and then putting them into a system, the State Department's database for nominating certain of these families for refugee status in the United States. When the evacuations actually happened, we accelerated in real time. We actually worked to get volunteers from around the department to then collect the documentation from different Department of Defense, either service members, former service members, or civilians who were nominating Afghans that they had worked with for entry into this State Department database. That was then coupled with what was happening on the ground, whereby the State Department was working to first prioritize certain groups to get to the airport and get onto planes for evacuation. And then there's another group of Afghans who actually were just coming up to the gates and then demonstrating that they had some sort of status to be able to be eligible for evacuation.
And Holly, turning to you now, you work at the State Department's Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. Tell me about that office. How big is it? And what are you typically doing when there isn't this huge influx of refugees coming into the country?
Well, in the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, I specifically work in the Office of Refugee Admissions. And our bureau has about a dozen people. And we have been operating a refugee resettlement program for decades, since the Refugee Act of 1980. It so happens that we have never done an emergency resettlement operation like this. This is unprecedented for us, but we do resettle refugees every year on an ongoing basis throughout the country.
You know, about a third of the country's resettlement offices had been closed during the previous administration because of lack of funding. What impact did that have on your work?
Particularly with this operation, Operation Allies Welcome, with the Afghans arriving to the United States, it made it much more challenging. The number of local resettlement programs around the country had diminished by a third. And then we also had less staff, less resources, less partnerships out in the community. So then when it became necessary to resettle in communities around the country, over 70,000 Afghans within 5 months, the capacity just wasn't there. It had to be developed overnight.
And Hila, you work to secure military bases as temporary housing for refugees. Tell us about that process.
Sure. Well, we have, offices within the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Policy who actually worked with, we have U.S. Northern Command who went around and looked at which bases had capacity or could build capacity, including by developing temporary housing, ensuring that they have appropriate security, ensuring that we're able to get enough resources to house refugees temporarily for a period of what would have been several weeks to months. And so that process actually had started, well before the evacuations. But as I mentioned before, when the evacuations were occurring, these different bases that had been identified worked very quickly to then build up that capacity for housing.
Holly, going back to you, once refugees started arriving, you had to figure out funding, you had to set up partnerships, get temporary housing, get permanent housing. Where did you start?
It really was like a big puzzle. We had to figure out how we could put in place all of the resources, the structure, the policy, and the funding in order to make this successful. So at the federal level, it was really an interagency effort. We worked together with our partners at Homeland Security, Department of Defense, Health and Human Services very, very closely, and we set up something called a resettlement branch that we operate to this day, where we actually sit together in person, even throughout much of the pandemic, in order to ensure that we could collaborate and put into place the pieces necessary. Then we fund our partners at the national and local level. They are the ones who do the direct services, the direct resettlement of refugees, finding housing, finding jobs, getting them enrolled in English, etc. And then lastly, it was the community. There was such an outpouring of goodwill and support from the community who really stepped up to help the Afghans. I think that they really felt just a commitment to helping this population. And it showed in the donations, in the volunteers that were all contributed to help Afghans be successful.
Can you tell us a particular story that you could share that really you felt illuminated the work that you did?
Yes, I will say at the federal level, we were working so closely, and I really believe that even though it was perhaps a little drier than the services that are done at the local level in terms of putting together resources, policy, briefings, I was told by one of our partners at the local level that seeing us work together as federal agencies made her proud to be an American. And that really just stuck with me.
Hila, back over to you. You know, you were essentially racing the clock, right? And working around the clock, trying to save lives. How did you deal with the emotional strain of that period of time?
Well, it was very difficult. My office was actually, we were at the time personally taking phone calls from different contacts who were calling us and asking us for help in getting their relatives through the gates or getting them through the system. I actually myself had some family members who were also trying to get out at the same time. And so it wasn't easy. You know, there are times where there's tears in the office, but there's also an adrenaline when you're working. I think it was a period of 17 days round the clock. All of your colleagues are working to do the same. There is just a huge network both within the government, but also private citizens or service members, former service members, who are all working in their own way to help save as many Afghans as they could. And so I think at the time it's emotional, but you're just focused on the work and then can, spend some time being emotional later.
And Holly, I would imagine that would be quite emotional. It was an emotional time for you all as well. Are you able to follow up with refugees and see how they're doing after they've been resettled?
Yes, to an extent. We actually do some after-action assessments. We interview refugees, Afghan refugees, in their homes virtually to understand how they're doing. Focus groups have been held. I hear stories all the time from our partners. One of them just recently told me about an Afghan woman who had never read a word in her life. And now she's taking English classes, and she was in the grocery store. And she was able to read some of the words in the grocery store and asked her husband if she was reading it correctly, and he told her she was. And she said that she just felt so much more confident and optimistic about her future, really for the first time.
You know, Hila, a lot of the news that's coming, that came out of the Afghanistan evacuation were negative for a lot of reasons. What do you want the American public to know about that process of evacuation and what your team and others within the Defense Department and the government did?
Sure. I mean, it's understandable that there was negative news because it wasn't exactly a happy or easy situation. But I would say to see the U.S. government, multiple departments and agencies, and then other current and former government members, military members, and then citizens kind of banding together, whether or not they realize they're all working for the same purpose, to see them work so intensely because of, frankly, just the compassion and then the desire to actually help the Afghans who had worked with us was actually quite significant. You know, even if we didn't get out everyone who we wanted, there's still a process by which some other Afghans are being evacuated. There was a real human compassion, human emotion behind all these efforts. And I think that a lot of our Afghan colleagues, especially those who are lucky enough to be able to be evacuated, really felt that.
And finally, Holly, what do you want the American public to know about the resettlement effort?
I want them to know that we have this wonderful opportunity. When I told that story earlier about the woman who just learned to read, I think about all the women and girls that now have this opportunity to live in freedom and to be able to have professions and freedom to move about society and contribute to society. So many have already found jobs and are in school and contributing. And it's just a wonderful story.
All right. Well, Hila and Holly, I want to thank you both for the work that you did during that time and that you continue to work on behalf of the American taxpayer. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on any future Government Matters interviews.